I am a photographer who lives in Rose Valley, Pennsylvania. My name is Carl Finkbeiner. I feel privileged to have observed over the years my community's idiosyncrasies and its many beauties, like this view from my driveway on a spring morning. In the process of observing Rose Valley, I have seen that it has repeated a pattern that I have noticed elsewhere in the flow of art through cities. In this pattern, industrial buildings are abandoned as business moves away. Artists seek out studio and living space there because it's cheaper and has big spaces. Galleries and shops spring up to serve them, attracting other businesses and institutions as developers start gentrifying and renovating. Gentrification is not always kind to a community, and sometimes it drives out the artist who started the process. But when the whole process works right, art stays and a balance is struck to form a uniquely connected community. Something very like that has happened here in Rose Valley. I will only be showing you images from the past 5 years. This is not a documentary history of Rose Valley, nor is it comprehensive. But it will be a story tracing the pattern I just described, using images providing impressions and feelings of this place to evoke our history. I give you this visual slice in time so you can see what I see here and feel what I feel while hearing the whispers of the past that I hear when I see this place. Perhaps from that you will get a deeper understanding of the Rose Valley I and many other people love so much. To illustrate the reverence many of us feel for Rose Valley, I turn to my friend Morris Potter, president of the Rose Valley Museum. Having spent most of her life here, she knows every place and almost every person. On a recent walk, I asked her if she ever got bored with something so familiar to her. She turned to me with an incredulous look and said, "No, this place is pure magic. I will do this forever." "Lead on," I said. I think of Rose Valley in terms of 3 main eras. First, the Waterways and their mills. Then the arts and crafts movement. And finally, a wildly interconnected community. Here in part 1, I will begin a long time ago. One of the first things I noticed about Rose Valley when I moved here is that there is running water everywhere, streams and creeks and runs and wetlands. Water here is framed by the landscape and provides a rich accent to it. It has both a restless and an eternal feel. Water has been here forever, of course, but its permanence possesses the tranquility of continual change, of constant, quiet motion, reminding us that things always move on in this place, even when everything else is frozen. Rapids and waterfalls abound on what is aptly named the fall line. The fall line is the geography along the East Coast, where the drop from uplands to coastal plains propels water abruptly and rapidly downward. The streams here attracted European settlers 340 years ago, particularly 3 brothers from England named Thomas, Robert, and Randall Vernon. Vernon Run, the stream running through the heart of Rose Valley, was named after them. Fast-moving water inevitably meant mills, 3 at least in Rose Valley. The first of them, originally the Stimmel Mill and now called simply the Old Mill, was built to make snuff in 1789 on Ridley Creek, the largest creek in Rose Valley. Milling was attempted with snuff, willow bark for fever, paper, animal feed, wood turning, and textiles. For about 100 years, mills were built here on the waterways and eventually failed. One mill, Hutton's Mill, left behind rapids at a broken-down dam that originally drove a mill race down the hill, diverting some of the waters of Vernon Run. It also left picturesque ruins of that dam, built where Minquist Run empties into Vernon Run. The pond formed there over a century ago to feed the mill race was used as a local swimming hole for many decades. Those mills in Rose Valley were built and failed repeatedly, with more than one fire damaging them. Milling of local products was tried for various agricultural ventures in the area. By the late 1800s, those industries moved elsewhere, and the mills finally ceased operating altogether, leaving behind picturesque buildings and ruins. Rose Valley slumbered, comprised mostly now of small farms and a few residences. The story might have ended there, but those abandoned ruins catalyzed a pivotal phase of Rose Valley, the arts and crafts movement. Following the pattern of the flow of art playing an essential role in community development, artists found these abandoned places. Around 1900, they began buying land in Rose Valley to start an artists' community. They were led by an exceptionally gifted and visionary architect named William Lightfoot Price, who designed the pergola, the ruins of which you see here. He established the Rose Valley Association very early on, based on the arts and crafts movement that was flourishing in England at the time, led by John Ruskin and William Morris. It was an outright reaction to the cheap mass production of the Industrial Revolution, adopting a more romantic vision of handmade artisanal craftsmanship. Those artists and crafters designed and built houses for themselves here, often using local materials of wood, stone, and creek sand in their construction. This included the liberal use of Mercer tiles from the local Moravian pottery and tile works. I find myself wondering about the interchange between Will Price and the founder of Moravian, Henry Chapman Mercer. Both were leading figures in the American arts and crafts movement, and they must have had some contact, given Price's heavy use of Mercer tiles in Rose Valley. Did Price, an expert in poured concrete architecture, offer Mercer pointers about constructing his poured concrete castle in Doylestown? I don't know, but I like to think so. Thunderbird Lodge is a fine example of an abandoned place revived for art. It was originally a stone dairy barn that Price converted into studios for a Philadelphia artist couple, Charles and Alice Barber Stevens. At the top of this image, we see the niche with what I believe is a Mercer tiled plaque above Alice's fireplace mantel in her studio at Thunderbird. I blended it above one of her illustrations, Taking Tea, completed before the Stevenses moved out to Rose Valley and now hanging in Thunderbird Lodge. There's a complex web of interconnectedness in Rose Valley, and the lady on the left in this painting represents several such connections. She's modeled on a Philadelphia family friend of the Stevenses, Elizabeth Warrington, whom everyone called Auntie Bess. She eventually moved into her home in Rose Valley that is still today referred to as Auntie Bess's house, built for her by her nephew, a cousin of Will Price, who worked in Price's firm. That arts and crafts community that Will Price established energized Rose Valley in this period. The old mill was rebuilt by the Rose Valley Association as a furniture shop. Artisans were brought in for the shop, the best wood carvers, woodworkers, and metalworkers, foremost among them a master carver named John Main. These craftsmen were given a lot of freedom in fabricating the heavy Gothic furniture, usually starting from Will Price's unique designs. Because of the furniture's sensuous wood grains and carvings, I imagine the artisans in the shop being inspired by the natural settings that they saw through their windows, settings that have inspired so many other creative types here. The old Hutton's Mill was reinvented by the Rose Valley Association as a guild hall for the Rose Valley folk, who named it Artsman's Hall. It became a place for the folk to gather, to make and to show art and craft, in general a place to make believe. There's never really been a business district in Rose Valley, but there were even a few commercial enterprises located within these walls as part of the Rose Valley Association. One such was an exceptional master potter, William Jervis, whose glazes were admired by Louis Tiffany. Alice Barber Stevens ran an art gallery in the hall for local artists to display and sell their works. Plays were put on by community members who called themselves the Rose Valley Players. There was studio and display space for the remarkable talent concentrated in this little village: writers, glassworkers, painters, musicians, architects, builders, stoneworkers, sculptors, even photographers. A print shop, the Rose Valley Press, was established in Philadelphia as part of the Rose Valley Association by a friend of Walt Whitman's named Horace Traubel, publishing, among other things, an arts and craft journal named The Artsman. The Rose Valley Association itself only lasted about 10 years. Then in 1916, Will Price passed away and arts in Rose Valley became less focused on arts and crafts. Despite those setbacks, Rose Valley continued to flourish artistically and socially because so many creative souls stuck around. The pattern of abandoned places attracting artists who start vibrant communities continued. Rose Valley had set the stage for its next big developments in the busy decade of the 1920s and then beyond. The Roaring Twenties roared in Rose Valley. There was a surge of community institutions, notably a theater, a swimming pool, a school, and the incorporation of the borough. Let's start with the theater. A young actor named Jasper Dieter from New York decided to take over the Artsman's Hall and make it into a repertory theater, naming it Hedgerow Theater. It survives as the oldest continually operating resident repertory theater in the country. Adult and child community members still participate along with the professionals at Hedgerow. For several years now, one of those children has been my grandson. There are layers of history in this building, if you know to look for it. Many of the artists in the community contributed their efforts to Hedgerow. Perhaps most prominent was a friend of Dieter's, a young artist woodworker from a nearby community named Wharton Esherick. He found a second home in the theater and contributed some remarkable furniture, some sculpture, and this unusual spiral staircase, now removed to the Rose Valley Museum. The plays and buildings of Hedgerow also inspired many of Esherick's phenomenal woodcuts, such as this one. Remember that old swimming hole formed by the dam where Minqua's Run emptied into Vernon Run? The land was owned by an artist couple named Yarnall and Eleanor Abbott, who in 1928 donated the land for a community swimming pool and financed it by selling some of Eleanor's paintings. We took our children there when they were little and still occasionally find our way to the pool to cool off and relax with friends. It has been so for generations of kids and their adults. Another part of the web of connections in Rose Valley, this bronze horse is a casting of one of a pair of carved wooden horses made by Wharton Esherick for Hedgerow Theater. This horse was named Jeter after Jasper Dieter. It stands at the entrance to the school in Rose Valley, which was started in the decade of the 20s, now located down the lane from Thunderbird Lodge. The school is a remarkable place. My children went there, and my wife and I have served variously on the board and in the classroom over many years. Every child is known and loved here. They believe in learning by doing and that rain is not an excuse to stay indoors. There is a reason so many ex-students have sent their children to SRV. Generations of kids have known exactly what to do with the bronze horse. You climb on it. It is a rite of passage for little ones to climb up on Jeter's back unassisted. My daughter brought her son here to climb this horse, just as she had many years before. In times when there are not pandemic lockdowns, this horse gleams from all the children sliding on and off. SRV started a great tradition in its first year, the annual May Fair. Children and their families gather for a day of singing, dancing, games, talking, food, and racing around with friends, mostly without close parental supervision because it is such a safe place. It always feels like a brilliant day, with the delicate new leaves and flowers echoing the young lives being celebrated. The virtual Mayfair of the first pandemic year of 2020 was brave and poignant, especially for those kids whose last year at SRV that was. There is no question, however, that the event will return one day as the vibrant, wide-open community Mayfair of the preceding 90 years. Rose Valley became an official borough of Pennsylvania in that decade of the 1920s. It located its borough office in the space at the old mill where Price's Rose Valley Furniture Shop had been. The tower and some new buildings, designed by Will Price's son Billy and a Walton cousin, were added around this decade while preserving some of the old ruins. It is still owned by the Rose Valley Folk, the community organization established at the beginning of the 1900s. The place is now often used for weddings, a lovely setting, one where our daughter got married. An important way that connections are revealed in Rose Valley is through a network of unmapped paths. They're not always easy to find. Most of them are away from roads and in undeveloped land or running through people's backyards. More than one new resident has been cautioned against unknowingly blocking the paths with plantings or construction. The old mill race from the now broken dam near the pool originally ran down the hill to power Hutton's mill. Today, on the berm next to the overgrown ditch that most people are not even aware was once a mill race, this path connects the physical play of the swimming hole, later the pool, directly to the artistic play at Artsman's Hall, now Hedgerow Theater. I'm charmed that the path is the shortest and fastest way to get from the pool to the theater or back. Fastest, that is, if you do not get lulled and distracted by the lovely, tranquil scenery. Another walking path through the backyards of Rose Valley follows an abandoned trolley track. The old trolley from Media clanked its way into Rose Valley at the old Penn Railroad commuter line, now SEPTA, and continued in a relatively straight line down to what is now the pool. At that point it stopped for travelers and then eventually made its way to Swarthmore and beyond. After the trolley line closed down, the tracks were repurposed as a walking path, with a bridge crossing Minquas Run at the same place as the old tracks used to be. Because of their importance to Rose Valley, most of its paths are cultivated and maintained year after year. This path over the bridge you see here extends from the trolley path across Minquas Run, spanning it so walkers can avoid soaked, muddy feet. They could have just laid a board across the stream. It's not wide or deep here after all, but that was not good enough. Something graceful and more permanent was wanted. And so they built this bridge as a memorial to Will Price shortly after his death, designed by his son, Billy Price, and built by his cousin, Herb Walton. You may be wondering, as I did for many years, about the name Minquas. So while you view it here, let me take a moment to explain. Minquas supposedly means treacherous in the language of the Lenape Indians who occupied this area before Europeans. It was their derogatory name for the Susquehannock Indians who tried to invade their territory from the west. An 80-mile trading route passing through what is now Rose Valley eventually became known as the Great Minquas Path and was the subject of a state historic marker and bronze sculpture installed here in the 1920s, of course. Sadly, the sculpture was recently stolen, but the Great Minquas Path left its name on this small, not very treacherous-looking tributary of Vernon Run. All of our paths tie together a community that is still evolving while honoring its past. Portions of the paths, like this stairway, have been there for many decades. The effort required to build and maintain them and their bridges signifies how much those paths meant and still mean in connecting Rose Valley. Our institutions and the real and figurative paths and bridges that connect them have established the legacy of this very vibrant community. Remember my friend Morris Potter, the president of the Rose Valley Museum, who knows everything about Rose Valley? Remember that I asked her once if she ever got bored with something so familiar to her? I will remind you that her response was, "No, this place is pure magic. I will do this forever." Morris is not alone in her feelings either. It is a great gift to Rose Valley to have this kind of passion in so many stewards of our community. For example, we still create new paths, such as the one here on Long Point. Nature is prominent in this now firmly established community, and paths enable its enjoyment, even while less tangible paths springing from our historic legacy of artistry are also being forged. Artists, unlike in some communities, have not been crowded out here. One delightful case in point. Nestled beside the trolley path in a very out-of-the-way location, you walk past a quirky reminder of artistry and craftsmanship. Though I'm not sure that Will Price, Alice Barber Stevens, or Wharton Esherick would have thought of chainsaw sculpture as art. Consider, though, that this is spontaneous creativity, made by hand from local materials, to delight passers-by treading the same paths of generations. Peculiar? Yes. Art? Maybe. Appreciated by its audience? Most certainly. The relatively new Rose Valley Museum keeps alive traditions, preserving many of our wonderful artifacts and teaching and celebrating our history. The museum is a relatively recent addition to the web of Rose Valley, located in the house and studios that Will Price built for Alice Barber and Charles Stevens. It has been my honor and my great delight to be able to photograph their collection there. The museum holds many memories and examples of the creative works of Rose Valley. I wish there could have been more such works. The association supported artists and their art in that creative burst at the beginning of the 1900s. The energy and enthusiasm and talent were still there after that in Rose Valley and continue in pockets. Lou DeMaul, an architect, and Jane Molesky, a teacher at SRV, being recent examples of exceptionally talented artists. I find that I wonder what else could have been created, though, if more of those who had the desire and talent for it had been able to dedicate their lives to art, as was once the case with the Rose Valley Association. Despite my wish for more from the past, it is heartening that new elements of a creative community have emerged over time, like the Valley Voices singing group, the Gardeners of Rose Valley, the delightful 5-minute-long 4th of July parade, an annual variety show, to name a few. I love Rose Valley, its generations of people, and the fantastical qualities this place has always possessed. And so the pattern holds in Rose Valley. Waterways to mills, flourishing then abandoned to artists whose art helps establish a unique community. There is no doubt that water still plays an important role in the Rose Valley community after having shaped its history, starting with the mills in the arts and crafts era. From the start, the creeks were used for recreation and provided stones and sand for construction. I am reminded when walking on Long Point, carved out by Ridley Creek, that before he moved here, a young Will Price and his friends picnicked here. They called themselves the Seekers After Knowledge, leaving behind the ruins of a little cabin overlooking Ridley Creek. Besides the physical shape of the community's roads and paths, the feel of our landscapes and geology, and the substance of our very building materials, The flow of water through Rose Valley has always provided inspiration. It inspires curriculum in our school. I mean, what child wouldn't love science class in a creek? It's inspired our architecture and our art, and it has inspired in us a sense of reverence for the beauty we are surrounded by. This final picture portrays an old institution at the start of day. The past is important to us in Rose Valley, and so is whatever comes next. Just as our mills were repurposed over and over, our community is constantly reinventing itself, starting anew through the efforts of many stewards. Despite fires, business failures, institutional struggles, and the general turmoil of any community of engaged citizens with differing opinions, in the future we can confidently say, nevertheless, they persisted. And why? Because this place, as Morris Potter says, this place is pure magic. My name is Carl Finkbeiner. I am a photographer and citizen of Rose Valley.